Welcome back to Dateline New Haven. This is Paul Bass inviting you to look behind the headlines on the stories that make our community tick. Well, we're going to go this segment from the state capital to Ukraine with one of the people in our community who understand what's happening in that hot spot better than just about anybody, David Cameron. David Cameron is a professor emeritus, lecturer in political science at Yale, former director of the Macmillan Center's program in European Studies, and one of the people more than 40 years ago who is guilty of having gotten me so interested in a lot of these issues. David Cameron, welcome to Dateline New Haven. Okay, we're not hearing you. Let me I apologize for that. Harry, do you know why we're not hearing Dave? Oh, he's muted. David, I think you're muted on your end. Can you unmute yourself on Zoom? We're doing this one by Zoom.
Can you hear me?
I sure can. Welcome to Dateline New Haven at WNHH. How you doing?
Good.
I should just just to be fair and transparent, back in the 70s, I took a course with David at Yale, and it blew my mind, and it got me interested in a lot of stuff around the world, including all these years later, what's happening now in Ukraine. And David's been writing about it, thinking about it, following it. David, before we go deep behind what's really going on and what's at stake in Ukraine, for the Ukrainians, for Russia, for the United States, for the post-Cold War world, I have a really simple question to ask you.
Yeah.
Which is this simple headline that is repeated day after day after day. It's been months now. Every day when I look at the Journal or the Times or the Post or on TV chyrons, it all says, will Russia invade Ukraine? I mean, this is a really simple question, right? They got 100,000 troops there by the border. But that's reported as news every day. People wonder, are they or won't they? And that gets repeated as the news, and it's making me wonder whether the story isn't whether or not they're going to get into Ukraine with troops, but whether Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia, wants us to be thinking about that question. Is that the real story?
Well, he certainly wants us to be thinking about that possibility. We now have something like 130,000 troops stationed on the border with Ukraine and also in Belarus, which is a, quote, a part of the Union state with Russia. So basically, Russia can send its troops into Belarus. And it would be very easy to go from where they are located there in southern Belarus to Kyiv and essentially put someone else in the government. That's one option. Another option is to go into eastern Ukraine, where the pro-Russia separatists, eastern Ukraine is, I'm not sure we covered this in that course a few years ago, but eastern Ukraine has a very substantial portion of the population that's of Russian heritage and Russian speaking, and pro-Russian separatists set up two republics focused in the two major cities in eastern Ukraine, Luhansk and Donetsk, and one problem from Russia's point of view is that Ukraine hasn't been implementing agreements that were negotiated by Russia, Ukraine, France, and Germany in 2014-15, called the Minsk agreements, that would give that area in eastern Ukraine a very substantial degree of autonomy, constitutionally, essentially giving it autonomy, not only economically but politically.
By autonomy, they meaning have it be more loyal to Russia and.
Yeah, it would require a constitutional reform that would essentially give powers to those areas to decentralize. I guess the easy way to say it is just decentralize power from Kyiv to.
Well, David Cameron, I feel like we're back in the Cold War, where when we read what is being written in the major media about it, you have to wonder what's being filtered through diplomats or through the lens of what the outcome they want to be. So what we're reading in recent days is in the regions of which you speak, in eastern Ukraine, that while there was a lot of Russian-speaking population, a lot of Russian sympathy, that has waned in recent years, according to what we're being told by the conventional wisdom, seen through Western eyes, that people see where the Russian control areas in Donbass, how life has gotten less free, there's more corruption, the economy hasn't done as well, there's more authoritarian control, and that even people who were sympathetic to Russia before are ready to fight to stop an invasion they're claiming, and that they even quoted the head of the Russian leading party there, saying that people are seeing on the ground what's happening. Is that true, or is that propaganda?
No, I think some of that is true. Probably some of that is true. I mean, the reality is that life is incredibly difficult there now. It's an area that has never really become peaceful. Ukraine is still carrying on a conflict with the pro-Russian separatists. So we have sort of a low-level continuing war that if you're a citizen living there, life is very difficult. It's dangerous, precarious. There's a high degree of insecurity there. So it's a very it's problematic. But coming back to the point about whether this notion of an invasion is
one really imminent?
Something we should think about and imminent. It's I think people who have been looking at this have been saying for some time, since last fall, that if there were to be an invasion, it would probably be sometime in February after the ground is really fully frozen, because the Russian tanks, which weigh 45 to 50 tons, can only go in on frozen ground. So, so we've heard that as the time frame. Now, the real question is, would Russia really do that, or is this just an elaborate effort to essentially intimidate the Ukrainians into implementing in full the Minsk agreements, or obviously trying to get the West to agree to the demands that Russia put forward for security guarantees,
which seem to be not really on the table, are they? Unless it be quietly allowed, like, we'll give you guarantees that Ukraine would never join NATO.
Yeah, they're not. Both the U.S. and NATO have said it's the old saying, what part of no don't you understand?
Yeah. So what's your answer, David? Obviously, you don't know. I don't think you should pretend to know. I'm not going to ask you to pretend to know. What's your gut on all this? What are we watching unfold?
I think what we're watching is an elaborate effort by Putin to use the military to induce France and Germany in particular to get you and the U.S. to get all of them to get Ukraine to fully implement the Minsk agreement, which would basically allow Eastern Ukraine to become you might say, a puppet state, basically owing its allegiance to Russia.
So, David, you're saying something here that I think is different from how this episode is being characterized in the mainstream media and in most conversation, unless I'm understanding you wrong. I think what I'm hearing from you is that Russia felt they had to deal with the Minsk agreement. The situation on the ground changed in Ukraine. Ukraine did not want to see Eastern Ukraine become a puppet state of Russia. They wanted to go in the other direction toward the West. So now Putin is using the threat of military action to try to get them to live up to that. I think that's different from how it's being portrayed. I think it's being portrayed that whether because he's having problems domestically, Putin, or he sees an opportunity because of weaknesses with the U.S. Retreat from Afghanistan and potential cracks in the NATO alliance, that Putin is trying to rebuild the Soviet Union and or take over Ukraine because of an historic quest to either undo the fall of the Soviet Union or go back 1,000 years to someone named Vladimir in Kiev, who Putin
Yeah.
traces his
Yeah.
legacy as some kind of. Is that general outlook wrong?
Well, no, I think both views are right in some sense. For example, if you read everything that Lavrov, the foreign minister,
Mhm.
um, says about all of this, it's very clear that for them, the big issue, and for him, and he's important, he's been around a long time as the foreign minister. Um, uh, the most important thing for him has been from day one the implementation of Minsk. And he said quite bluntly that if Minsk were fully implemented, um, uh, if Minsk were fully implemented, sorry,
It's okay. They won't invade.
that the crisis would be resolved.
Now, why doesn't
Um,
Ukraine want to
but
implement it? Or was I wrong about that? That they've had to change of government? They've had a country that clearly doesn't want to go more in the Russian orbit. Is that what it's about? And have they broken their word?
Well, yeah. Well, basically, implementation of Minsk means de facto um, separation of eastern Ukraine from from
Yeah.
Ukraine. It means basically it would have full autonomy. It's a very important segment of Ukraine, in economically speaking. It's a heavily industrialized area. It's an important area for Ukraine. They don't want to leave it lose it, obviously. So, I mean, that's one part of it. But the other point you mentioned is important. Putin once said in one of his annual addresses that the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century was the breakup of the Soviet.
Which is amazing when you think about the Holocaust of World War II.
Yeah, when you think of what
Yeah,
when you think of
World
what
War
Russia
One.
experienced in World War II,
Yeah.
for anyone to say that the breakup was the most devastating catastrophe of the 20th century is just an astounding
Do you
statement.
have sympathy with Putin on this question of the Minsk agreement?
Um, I don't have sympathy. I don't have sympathy with him in general.
Hmm.
So I certainly
So
don't want to say that.
do
But
you
it
think?
is the case. It
Yeah.
is the case that in the Minsk agreements that were signed in 1415, that there was an agreement uh, that Ukraine would institute uh, undertake constitutional reform that would give a degree of autonomy, decentralized power to Eastern Ukraine, and the Russians are very peeved because those two republics, the pseudo republics that were set up in Luhansk and Donetsk, had planned to have referendums that would have been like the Crimean referendum, calling for independence, calling for them to be incorporated into Russia. And those statelets essentially agreed not to have those referendums because Minsk would give them autonomy and give them full power.
So
So,
what's at stake for the U.S. and the West? Why should we care about this?
well, we should care a lot, it seems to me, because Putin is essentially you. He now has the estimates are about 130,000 troops,
Hmm.
basically circling Ukraine, and he's clearly using a force as a threat. And this is a state that is basically being told to accept what we are saying, and you can imagine what they would like is for example, Ukraine to say, we are never going to try to get into NATO.
Hmm.
Um, and we are never going to have NATO-based troops in our country. Um, and now that I don't think is going to happen, um, but you can never tell with Macron getting into the conversations with Putin all the time.
And the reason the U.S. should care, we obviously care about human beings who live in Ukraine. We care about governments not invading other governments. What's at stake for the U.S. in this, and what actions should we take?
Well, I think what's at stake in the U.S. for the U.S. If you just think in terms of NATO, Article 5, which commits the U.S. to defend any other country in NATO if it's attacked, you could imagine that people in the Pentagon would get very anxious about Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, for example, which are all NATO members. So there is that.
The idea is if it goes in there, they could be next. That could up the ante for nuclear confrontation.
Yeah, they could roll into Estonia and take Estonia, and it certainly wouldn't take 130,000 troops to do that. And the U.S. would be involved in that and committed to that. And it's so I think I mean, part of the problem is for the U.S. is they obviously can't say they can't give Russia the security guarantees it wants. They can't say Ukraine can never become a member of NATO. They just aren't going to say that. NATO's not going to say that. The U.S. isn't going to say that. And Russia continually comes back to sort of the founding principles of the European security system, which say states have a right to choose their alliances, but secondly, states cannot, in choosing their alliances, threaten the security of some other state. And the Russians keep saying, well, you believe in rule number one, but you don't believe in rule number two, and we're supposed to believe in both rules. And so, if Ukraine don't join NATO, it will be affecting our security because they can put the weapons, these various weapons that could reach Russia much more easily.
So you wrote this week, David, there is a pathway to a peaceful resolution of this crisis.
Yeah.
What is that pathway?
Well, the pathway is actually what happened. We started down this pathway last Wednesday. There was an 8-hour meeting in Paris, hosted by Macron, of representatives of the 4 countries, the Normandy 4. The Normandy 4 are France, Germany, Russia, and Ukraine. It's called the Normandy 4 because those 4, the leaders of those 4 met in Normandy in June 6, 2014, on the 70th anniversary of D-Day, and essentially agreed to negotiate the agreements that we now know as the Minsk agreements, the initial ceasefire in September of 2014, and then a full agreement in February 2015. And that's the agreement that stipulated that Ukraine would pass legislation that would recognize the special status of these statelets, and would reform the Constitution to essentially decentralize power and give them autonomy.
So what's the path? The path you think is not the U.S.
is resurrecting the Minsk talks, the Normandy format talks. And last Wednesday, a week ago, there was an 8-hour meeting of representatives of those 4 countries at the Élysée in Paris, the presidential palace and they began to, you might say, resume the Minsk discussions or discussions about the Minsk agreements, and they're going to meet next week as well. That's a possible pathway, and the only reason I say it's a possible pathway is because Russia has said that on any number of occasions in the statements, especially that Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, has said. For example, when the new German foreign minister came to visit, and in other statements.
So the U.S. is not crucial to that. We're not at the table.
No, the U.S. is out of it. The U.S. is out of it, and in fact, offered to participate and was basically told, no, we'll deal with this ourselves.
So it's fair to say you think there's a possible pathway out. It involves what's going to be the status of the discussions reviving the Normandy 4 about the Minsk agreement. We have to cut it off. I'm sorry about that, David. Are you optimistic about that pathway? Do you think we're going to come out of this okay?
Not highly optimistic, but I waver in this. I can easily see Russian troops going in, either to eastern Ukraine or even going to Kyiv and trying to put in a new leader. But I think that is probably something that even Putin wouldn't try. So my guess is they will try to see if they can get through this intimidation and through this presence of 130,000 troops and tanks and so forth, get the Normandy format talks to come up with a solution.
So is it fair to say your take is Putin would like there to be an out, and the out has to come through the Normandy talks and the Minsk agreement?
Yeah, I think that's right. And
but that won't necessarily. He won't necessarily find the out.
I think he would prefer that to use the military to induce the West to basically put enough pressure on Ukraine to cave in.
Do you think Ukraine will cave in?
I think they're in the process of caving in. I think Biden has made it very clear to Zelensky on several occasions, and I think that will happen. But it's a very difficult issue for Zelensky because the Minsk agreements were negotiated by his predecessor, who was also his opponent in the presidential election, and who will also be his opponent in the next election, a man named Poroshenko. So in addition to the problem that if you're a president of a country, the last thing you want to do is essentially give up control over a very substantial and important part of the country.
All right. Well, we got a little bit over. And I just want to let people know you.
Sorry.
No, don't apologize. I appreciate it. I want to let people know you're listening.
It probably reminded you of my classes.
I loved your class. And I learned all about the church committee. And I just want to remind people that are listening to WNHH LP-FM on 103.5 FM, live streamed at newhavenindependent.org, broadcasting from New Haven, Connecticut. That's just the legal work we have to do for the FCC. David Cameron, thank you so much for enlightening us here on the Ukraine crisis. You have always been someone I love to hear what you have to say or write about criminal justice in New Haven to the third iteration of the Cold War abroad. And I appreciate all the work you do. And thanks for joining us on Dateline New Haven.
Great. Thank you.
We're going to take it out with the Afro-Semitic Experience performing I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free from the group CD A Plea for Peace, which we are sending to Ukraine right now. And thanks to Harry Joe, station manager. We're going to invite you to fly free with us all day and all night here on WNHH FM, New Haven's home for community radio.